Welcome to Podcast Movement 2023.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this masterclass. I hope that you had a fantastic first day at PodMove event. As part of our next-gen podcasting track, we are here to wrap up the day with a topic that's key to your podcast growth, crafting your listener persona. I'm Jennifer. Wait a minute. I think it doesn't work, sorry. Can wait a moment, I can still introduce myself. So I'm Jennifer, but feel free to call me Jen. I serve as the Chief Marketing Officer at Ausha, and before this, I spent 7 years at L'Oréal working in the international marketing department within the cosmetic industry. However, in 2019, I decided to follow my passion and creating my own media platform focused on food and chefs. Naturally, this venture included a podcast, which I hosted myself, and it was through this podcasting journey that I discovered Ausha, initially as a user, and later on joined the executive as a CMO. With over a decade of marketing experience under my belt, one thing that always amuses me is taking big and general marketing concepts and adapt them for practical use for the podcasting community. And you will see this in action with the latest framework I've created. JD, does it work now? Yeah, perfect, you rock. So today, I've traveled all the way from Paris to be here with you. I must confess, I'm completely jet-lagged. It's currently 1 a.m. in my time zone, so I hope you will be understanding if I seem a bit off, but I promise I'll do my best to keep it together and not fall asleep on stage. And if I do so, please wake me up. For those unfamiliar with Ausha, we are an all-in-one platform providing a comprehensive suite of tools that simplify the process of podcasting from unlimited hosting and distribution to analytics and marketing. What sets us apart from all other hosting platforms is our advanced podcast marketing tools. We will soon offer features like podcast SEO for better visibility on platforms like Apple Podcast and Spotify. We make social media promotion easy with the ability to generate video teaser and AI-crafted written posts by ChatGPT in just a few clicks. Plus, we provide best designed website and player, as well as a unique link tree, all designed for better audience conversion. So many cool stuff that I won't take our 30 minutes together to tell you everything, so if you want to know more, do not hesitate to pass by at our booth or to visit our website, ausha.co. Now let's talk about the magic formula for podcast success. Yes, there is a magic formula. It sounds simple, but it's easier said than done. If we boil it down to the basics, it's about having a good podcast, obviously, and a good promotion and good promotional assets, right? However, there is a fundamental element that often gets overlooked. But in my opinion, it's something you can't succeed without. And that's targeting the right audience for your podcast. Without this, everything else you do may not make sense. And this is often why many podcasters struggle with building a loyal and growing audience. It's crucial to know who you're speaking to in order to create content that resonates, engage, and ultimately achieve success. So how do we target the right audience? The answer lies in 2 steps: defining your listener persona and reaching them on the right channel at the right time. And today, it's all about tackling these 2 steps. All right, let's dive into the heart of the matter. When we talk about targeting the right audience, the first question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we envision our typical listener? What does that person look like? Let's take the example of my previous podcast, where I presented biographies of gourmet chefs. In my imagination, I had a certain image of my typical listeners. As you notice, we kind of look alike. As humans, we can't help but imagine someone who resembles us, with similar characteristics. However, when I met my listeners and looked at my stats, the reality was quite different. My typical listener was not a young woman, in her early 30s, passionate about gastronomy, eager to learn more about the chefs of the restaurant she already had discovered. Instead, it was more often a man in his early 40s who enjoyed my content for entertainment, often while relaxing at home, sometimes, well, most of the time, even while eating junk food. It's like when you're watching Top Chef, you're always eating junk food, right? And my podcast was helping him to discover new places, And this isn't a bad thing. It was just different from my initial imagination. But it was incredibly interesting to better understand my listener, which allowed me to adapt not only my podcast content, but also my promotional content to better suit their needs and interests. Now I propose we bring a little bit of methodology to all of this. Let's structure the definition of a listener persona and create a framework that will become your compass, that will guide all your podcast strategy. First, to ensure we are all on the same page with terminology, let's clarify what a persona is. A persona is a fictional character created to represent a specific user type, ideally based on research and data, to help guide decisions in a product or marketing strategy. We've adapted this general marketing concept specifically for podcasting, introducing the notion of a listener persona. Now, you might be wondering why we need to focus on a typical listener. Why not aim to reach everyone? And yeah, you want to be greedy. The truth is, if you try to target everyone, you always end up reaching no one. That's a hard truth, but especially in podcasting, which is a medium that requires high engagement. So it's crucial to create a portrait of the most stereotypical listener. Of course, your podcast will resonate with people outside of this core target, I can reassure you. But you'll have a better chance of finding your audience by focusing on one specific group. And perhaps, as your podcast grows, you can start to target other groups. But I would advise you to work one target at a time before moving on to the next. So here it is, ta-da, our listener persona framework, currently blank, obviously. But our mission over the next few minutes will be to understand how to construct and adapt it to a listener persona. We'll dissect each part together and fill it in with a concrete example. Fundamentally, our model is based on answering 4 simple key questions. Why should someone listen to your podcast? Who is listening to your podcast? And when and where can you reach them? Pretty basic, right? All right, let's dive into how to fill out this framework. Now, the first thing you might notice is that there isn't a lot of space dedicated to information about your podcast. That's intentional, because we often spend too much time talking about ourselves and our podcast. But the key to growth is focusing on our target audience instead of ourselves. Otherwise, it's better to just stay alone in your room and talking to yourself in front of a mirror. So we are going to start by just putting down the bare essentials about our podcast. First, write down the category and subcategory of your podcast if you have one. This serves as a reminder to yourself about the category in which you've chosen to present your podcast to your listeners and where they can find you on listening apps. Next, we are going to craft a short pitch for your podcast. This should be a single, concise sentence that captures the essence of your podcast. Remember, we are not trying to cover every detail here. We don't care about you. We just want the core idea, the unique selling point that makes your podcast stand out. For example, again, if we go back on my past podcasts, it will be simply biographies of gourmet chefs told as stories. The simplest, the most understandable. Now that you've put your name on the paper, or in this case, your podcast name, we can focus on the most important part, questions about the listener. And always start with the why. This is what we call in French the raison d'être, or the fundamental reason for existence of your podcast, and should guide everything you do for it. So it should indicate why someone should listen to your podcast. What's their interest and motivation to grant you some of their precious time? Much more difficult question, right? To define why should someone listen to our podcast, we need to step into our listeners' shoes and understand their needs or desires. I'm going to share a model I learned during my time at L'Oréal, which we use to define consumer insights for cosmetic products. It's the I want because but model. And we are going to adapt it for our needs in podcast marketing. The goal is to fill in the sentence from the listener's perspective. What would you say about what they want? So, about what your listener wants, this should be the main goal or objective that the listener is trying to achieve by consuming your podcast content. It could be something like learning about a new topic, self-improvement, finding entertainment, connecting with a community, or just relaxing. Now, to tackle why, so because of why they are consuming or looking for content, here you need to find the key benefit that the listener gets from consuming your podcast content. It could be gaining expertise in a field, for example, achieving a sense of well-being, why not becoming a better version of themselves, relating to a community, or just simply enjoying their time. And finally, here is a but. It's always a but. It's where this is a point of dissatisfaction and unfulfilled need that the listener has with the current content available to them before you're launching your podcast or before they're discovering your podcast. This is where your podcast comes in. It should aim to fill this gap and meet this unmet need. It could be, I don't know, a lack of reliable content on a certain topic. There are still topics that are not thought about in podcast medium. A desire for more engaging storytelling. Think about business wars. We have a lot of documentary about business stories, but the way they're telling it, the storytelling they have on it, it's unique. It can also be a need for content that fits into their busy schedules. For example, we created our own podcast tips, all the tips for podcasters to grow their audience in just 5 minutes format. So, because you guys are busy, of course. Let's jump directly into a concrete example to help you better understand. So, let's apply the I want because but model to the podcast Soul Sisters Sleep Meditation. They are guided meditation for Black women. I want to, for her listeners would say, I want to find guided meditation that help me relax and sleep better because it will improve my overall well-being and help me manage stress. So far, so good. You have many podcasts about that, even relaxing app and other type of content. But I'm looking for content that resonates with my experiences as a woman of color, specifically Black woman, which is often missing in mainstream meditation resources. And that's a true need. Because when you have affirmation, and I see you, Charity, like shaking your head, and I feel you. when you have affirmation that doesn't resonate in you, the meditation is less efficient. It is something. So here, the listener persona for Soul Sister sleep meditations might be a woman of color who is seeking guided meditation to improve her sleep and manage stress, okay? But it's also looking for content that resonates with her own experience and identity. I must say, I'm a big fan of this podcast, and it's a great example of a podcast that has clearly defined its listener persona and delivers content that directly addresses their needs and desires. So what I propose that we use it as a case studies as we dive into the listener persona framework. So now that we've seen how to apply the I want because but model, you might be wondering how this helps us define why our target listeners should listen to our podcast. Well, the insight we gain from this model will directly inform you what makes your podcast unique and appealing to your target listener. By understanding our listeners' main goal, the key benefit they seek, and their point of dissatisfaction or desire, we can identify the unique aspects of our podcast. These become the elements that set our podcast apart and make it a must-listen for our target audience. And it's from these elements that we're going to extract what we called the unique sharing points, which we'll delve into next. So we repurposed the marketing concept of unique selling points, for the one who might know, to the unique sharing points, the USPs as well. Here you have the sophisticated definition, but in a simple word, you need to define in a few keywords what key aspects your listeners will highlight when sharing your podcast to others, as simply as that. In the case of Soul Sisters, the USPs could be its cultural relevance, its focus on relaxation and stress relief, and its empowering content. These USPs directly address the needs or desire of the listener persona, making the podcast a unique and valuable resource for its target audience. These are also the 3 key points that will hook your target listeners. Now that we've established the why, the reason someone should listen to your podcast, it naturally leads us to the who. Understanding why someone would tune into your podcast helps us better envision who that person might be. To define the ID of our typical listener, we need to focus on 3 main dimensions. First, demographics, that include factors like gender and age. Second, affiliations, that refers to the communities your listener identify with, or their political leanings, for example. And then the lifestyles, that encompasses elements like fashion style, grocery shopping preferences, or tech usage, or everything you can imagine to define the lifestyle. For example, for the tech usage, you can try to answer the question that, are my listeners more Apple people or Android people? And you know that it means a lot. For the demographics, we are looking at gender, which can be gleaned from stats available on podcast hosts like Ausha and platforms like Spotify for podcasters. We also want to establish a median age for the listener persona framework. While age range data are available on these platforms, it's often more useful to set a specific median age for your persona framework because it's easier to imagine someone like who is 38 than someone that is between 20 and 30. It's a huge range. Location is another important demographic factor. You will be able to find country source in most host platforms, also on Spotify for podcaster, Apple Podcast Connect, and also on Ausha. But less actors will provide state and city, but we do. Next, we have affiliations. This is where we delve into the listeners' political leanings or community affiliation or other group identities. This information can often be gleaned from direct interaction with your listeners. For example, by conducting a quick poll by email or on Instagram stories. You can easily, on Instagram, use the question stickers to ask them your question about that and get feedback in less than 24 hours. And on the side of waiting for the answers, you can also dig into the accounts, of the one who follow you on social media platforms. People are following you, and most of the time they have public profiles, so the account are public, then, well, feel free to see what type of people are following you the most, What are they sharing, how they look like, what type of, hobbies and other things they're sharing. This is when stalking becomes a market research. Here, you're allowed. Lastly, we have lifestyle. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of the listener's personal preferences and habits. What's their fashion style, what are their hobbies, where do they shop for groceries, for example? You don't find the same crowd at Whole Foods versus Aldi, right? These details can give us a more qualitative understanding of our listeners' personality and culture. Remember, the goal here is to learn more about your listeners as individuals. So, same things as affiliation, don't hesitate to ask them directly. Conduct social media polls, or even look at their personal profiles on platforms like Instagram or Twitter, as I mentioned earlier. The more you know about your listeners, the better you can tailor your podcast to their interests and needs. And here's a little tips to enrich your framework. Consider using binary questions, like the example I used earlier, like are they Apple or Android, are they Whole Foods or ID, are they Democrat or Republican, to help stereotype your persona. This simple question can reveal a lot about your listeners' values and habits. It can be a great starting point for understanding their lifestyles and affiliation. So, let's apply to our example, the Soul Sisters podcast. So on the demographics part, okay, we'll take some data-based, most of them from Ausha, but I want to respect confidentiality for our podcasters, so I intentionally we won't be accurate here, but for the sake of the example, we can say that the typical listener is a woman at the median age of 38 years old, living in the US, specifically in New York. Her affiliation, she likely identified as a Black woman, part of a mindfulness and wellness community, and she can be an advocate for Black women's empowerment. And about her lifestyle, what thing that maybe we can search and find out, we can discover that, for example, she values self-care, shop at wellness-focused stores like Whole Foods, and her fashion style leans towards comfortable brands like Athleta or Lululemon. Remember, these are educated assumptions. It's always best to validate this by engaging directly with your listeners. And cherry on the top, now to make this persona more relatable and easier for your brains to visualize our listener persona, let's humanize her. Give her a name to finalize her identity. In that example, let's call her Tasha, because I love that name. And for a bit of fun, you could even generate a portrait using an AI image generator like Midjourney. And this way, every time you think about your podcast, you're thinking about how Tasha will react, what Tasha will want to hear, and how best to engage with Tasha. That makes it easier for your brain most of the time. Remember, Tasha is not just a persona, she represents your target listeners. But understanding her helps you create a podcast that truly resonates with your audience. Now that we've identified who our listener is and why they might be drawn to our content, it's time to determine the best times and places to reach them. This is where you have, this is the inception part of my presentation. You have like one framework within another framework. But this is the listener's typical day Canva, a key component of our listener persona frameworks. And this Canva is split into two sections, very simple, weekdays and weekend, because you don't have the same life during your weekdays and during your weekends. And you have all each part of the day split it from the morning to the nighttime. And here on that Canva, we will pinpoint what our listener is doing, the main goal or activity they are more likely doing at each moment of the day, which device they are using, and what channels they are engaged with. So now let's put this Canva into action with our Soul Sisters podcast example. The goal here is to identify the prime moments to connect with them, whether it's to promote your podcast or share snacking content related to your podcast topic. These are the golden opportunities when our content is most likely to resonate and engage. For example, in the case of Soul Sisters podcast, for the sexual exercise, we've identified that weekday evenings are the best time for our listeners to tune into the podcast. However, there are other times during the day when we can push promotional content. But be mindful of when you do this. For example, during the workday rush, might not be the best time to share relaxing quotes, when you're at work, you're in a rush and something between two meetings, you are not sensitive to feel good and things, quote like this, you just, okay. You want to stay active. But during your break, your lunch break, or during, before your nighttime, here, there are good moments, when you will be more sensitive to that type of content or type of messaging. So how do we gather this information? Well, I don't invite you to stalk your listener in real or hire PI. It's all about truly getting to know our audience. This goes beyond surveys and market research. It involves direct engagement, conversation, and understanding the habits, routines, likes, and dislikes. To get this information, don't hesitate to meet your listeners, whether it's through video calls, coffee meetings, or discussion on your social media platform. Don't hide behind your microphone. Collaborate with them. And of course, a data junkie like me will always tell you to not underestimate the power of analytics. Platforms like Ausha offer invaluable data about when your listeners are the most active, but don't stop there. Analyze your website traffic data to identify peak engagement times. Test different social media posting times and observe when you get the most interactions and towards which type of messages or which type of creatives. Yeah, in a general basis, just be creative. Everything that helps you to paint a comprehensive picture of a listener's day, All right. Oh, congrats. We've now completed the listener persona framework. However, remember that this is not a static document. It's a compass that guides your podcasting journey, but it's organic in nature. You'll make your first draft, and then it will evolve over time. The more you learn, the more you will adapt it, the more you will refine it. The more you interact and understand your listeners, the more you will adjust it and make it more relevant and make it more powerful. It gives you a reference document to help you guide your decisions and your communication planning for your podcast. I see your faces. I know that it's a lot of work to create that listener persona, but I can guarantee you that the time and energy you are putting here, you will save it later, because when you will work on your promotion strategy, it will go without saying. Because think about it. Now you know on which channels to tackle them, which devices your listeners are using, when to post on social medias, and when to release new episodes. It will help you as well to craft key messages thanks to your USPs. That you know that what type of messages will hook your listeners, or on what point you need to push on. And that will guide you on how to target your audience with ads, hashtag, and even location. Remember, the key to successful podcasting is not just creating great content, but also understanding your audience and reaching them effectively. With the listener persona framework, you are staying on track with a focus and coherent strategy, hence more efficient. Now it's time to create your own listener persona. You'll find a QR code here. I saw many of you taking pictures along the way, but don't worry, you will find everything through the ebook you can download through this QR code. Simply scan it, and you will be able to download a blank listener persona framework. And don't worry, the instructions are included, so you'll have a step-by-step guide to help you along the way. And let me leave you with a few more tips. If you want to know more about Ausha, please visit the website ausha.co and start for a trial for free if you want. On the same website, you also have a great blog with many educational articles. If you don't want to read, no problem. We created the show Tips on YouTube with funny short tutorials about podcasting from A to Z. And if you prefer, of course, to listen to a podcast, you will also find our podcast in the same name of Tips. You can listen it on all platforms, obviously. Thank you for your time and energy today. You have noticed that I didn't fall asleep. And I wish you all a great PodMove week. We have 1 minute left, so if anyone have a question, you can just raise your hand and Jack will bring you a mic. We have one question here.
Hi, I was wondering, so if you already have a podcast that you can look at data from of your audience, how much of your persona should you be building based on your audience you already have, and how much should you be building on the audience you want? If those, or does that make sense?
Oh, sorry, because it was hard to hear from here, but if
sorry. I could, go ahead.
Yeah, without the mask, maybe, if you don't mind.
How much of the persona should you be building on the audience you want to have versus the audience you do have, if you already have a podcast?
Okay. That's an interesting question. Well, the thing is, how come that the audience you want to have is not the one you already have? That's the first tricky question. Like, how did you end up with that? Then, and is it that much an issue? Think about it. If the audience you already have, there are people who are interested by your content, even though they are not the first one you wanted to target at the beginning. Is it a problem that you have this audience today? Like, do you want to change the audience? There are already people who are interested and becoming loyal to your show. So you created your community, and in a way, let's say that we get the community that we deserve, we get the audience that we deserve, and if it's not an issue, well, if it's becoming an issue, then it means that you need to rebrand your podcasts. You need to change your positioning for sure. And then for that, I would advise that if you define the persona you want to tackle, then maybe try to ask them, but since you don't have the database yet, and you won't have them on social media, obviously, because you have another community, maybe try to work with other podcasters that have the community you want to reach. And first, chat with them. Maybe they already know a lot of things about their audience they can share with you, and why not then asking them, to conduct some of the polls and all the stuff in order for you to define, how to better tackle the audience you want to target then. Thank you so much. Have a great evening and see you around.